What does high quality revenue look like? How does that help us diversify our revenue streams? How does that help us protect against revenue leak? It sounds like all of these things are connected.
As an organization, you need to have these concepts when you think about who are we all going after, who are we serving, who are we building for, marketing to, selling to, delivering for. And I think that's what we think about as ideal customer profile. And then that cost to serve piece is a really important piece of it.
You're faced with a pivotal challenge as a revenue leader centered around the shift from being a VP of sales to taking on the role of Chief Revenue Officer. This transformation comes with evolving priorities and responsibilities as your company expands and evolves. It's like moving from one part of a chessboard to another, where your strategic thinking and decision-making must adapt to the changing landscape. Understanding these shifting dynamics and embracing the broader scope of responsibilities is critical for success, making it essential for revenue leaders to explore the nuances of this transition and how it affects their roles in the ever-growing company. It can be quite a transition, but there are critical steps that need to be taken in order to be fully equipped for success. Robby Allen is the CRO at AgentSync, where he is known for his strategic prowess in optimizing revenue and driving business growth. In this episode of the Run Revenue Show, Robby shares the transition from VP of Sales to Chief Revenue Officer, the key tips to help make the transition seamless, and how to work best at different stages of business growth. Make sure to listen through this full episode as Robby drops essential tips that every revenue leader needs to hear.
I'm Kyle Coleman, sales pro turned SVP of marketing at Clary. Run Revenue is the show where revenue pros learn to stop revenue leak, achieve revenue precision, and grow their companies and careers.
This is Run Revenue Show with Kyle Coleman.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Run Revenue Show. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my fellow Denverite, Robby Allen. Robby is the CRO at AgentSync, and we're going to be talking all about this transition from VP of Sales to Chief Revenue Officer. We're also going to be exploring what it's like to work at companies at different stages of growth. But before we dive in to the topic at hand, let's learn more about you, Robby. Who are you? Where have you been? What do you do now?
Fellow Denverite indeed. We're probably no more than 4 miles away from each other right now. So it feels almost a little missed opportunity to be doing this together, but maybe the next time around. No, I'm really happy to be here, Kyle. I appreciate the opportunity to share stories, insights, and hopefully add some more value to the community. So a little bit about me. Born and raised in San Francisco. I grew up in the Haight-Ashbury for those of us who spent some time there right next to Golden Gate Park. Spent a career in B2B SaaS and in tech right out of school. I had the fortune to fall into a couple of opportunities at some high growth unicorn companies. The first one of those was a company called Zenefits. During my time there, I really got into the trenches of high growth scale. I hired and built out a team of 250 SDRs while I was there at a satellite office in Scottsdale, Arizona. Learned a lot about the universe of velocity sales, doing that, and talent development and growing teams and careers, and looked really fondly on that time. Then I went to Flexport, which is a company in the supply chain and logistics space. And I got to run the global inside sales team there and learn a lot more about selling into different markets all over the world and started to move more into the enterprise. And today, I'm the CRO at a company called AgentSync. And AgentSync is a B2B SaaS company with a specific vertical focus on insurance and financial services. It's very much an enterprise play. I've seen different stages of growth along the journey. I've seen transactional, I've seen enterprise. Today, my focus is very much on enterprise. Outside of that, I've got a kid and another one on the way, and that occupies, honestly, almost every other corner of my life. I love to compete and play basketball, do that kind of stuff, and just get outside. And having come from California to Colorado, I can't speak highly enough of this place and this state and all of the fun stuff you can do out here. If I'm not working on building this company, I'm probably spending time with my family outside, having fun.
Wonderful. The outdoor amenities here are just out of this world. From Zenefits to Flexport to AgentSync, at different stages of growth, different priorities, different segments, different modes of velocity, all these types of things. Let's maybe break it down a little bit, Robby. I don't know, how big was Zenefits and Flexport when you started there?
We were sub 15 million in revenue at Zenefits. I was the 60th employee. So product market fit was there. We had just raised our Series A. Series B came quickly thereafter. It was hit and go fast and go big was at the Zenefits moment.
We could draw arbitrary lines between a series of funding, or we could do it between different revenue levels or something like that. But I'm curious basically to hear your overall take on maybe the distinction of running a sales team, inside sales, or now in your role as CRO at a growth stage company, let's call it in that sub 50 million range. And then what is the distinction or difference in running revenue at a larger company? Talk to us about the headline differences.
I think the priorities as a leader change quite a bit. And I think this is why sometimes you see revenue leaders get pinned or pigeonholed as either a growth stage leader or an early stage leader, because the skill sets are fundamentally different in terms of what you're trying to do. And evolving and making that leap from stage to stage is something that a very short list of people have done, some of whom who have been guests on this podcast. And it's not to say it can't be done. It's just to say that what the business requires of a CRO at 50 to 100 million in revenue just looks fundamentally different than the person who's in charge of revenue when you're going from 0 to 10. Maybe taking it from the earlier side of that lineage and then working our way up. In the early days, when you're the first version of sales is typically founder-led sales getting handed to somebody else doing it, a head of sales. If you're a head of sales, you're also your head of recruiting. You're also the head of RevOps. You might be carrying a marketing bag to some extent because your head of marketing partner hasn't been hired yet. You're in deals, you're selling deals, you're trying to figure out what works and then make it repeatable. What you're really looking to do from that 1 to 10 stage is finding repeatability and then proving that you can take 2 reps and then make 4 reps successful and then make 8 reps successful and that you can scale revenue in this way. And that is where most companies die. I should say in the 0 to 1 phase, and then the next most likely phase of that happening is 1 to 10, because finding repeatability is just a really difficult thing to do. That takes somebody who is scrappy, who is willing to get into the weeds and run deals themselves, but also somebody who has these foresight to see, I'm going to need to replace myself and move myself out of a lot of these day-to-day work streams in order to scale and make the next step. So you do that, you hire a team of people that kind of scale into running these deals, you hire a frontline manager, and now you're looking at 10 to call it 25 million in revenue. And this is where forecasting and being right about your quarters and your months starts to become really important. You've probably raised some money. You might have built a board and had a couple board meetings along the way. And now a miss is going to be big enough and material enough that it's going to be difficult to make up in the next quarter. And obviously Clary has an inside look at a lot of this because your guys' customers, they use their product for one thing to forecast and look at and size risk. One of the things you're looking to do after you get a repeatable motion down is, how can I get the organization focused on the right type of customer who has the highest propensity to buy? And how can I institute a little bit more rigor and a little bit more consistency in my sales process so that when I'm forecasting deals, I know that certain things are true depending on the stage of where these opportunities are. And I would say the third thing that you're starting to do from that 10 to 25 million is really starting to think about diversifying revenue streams. You might have just been selling one single product on your journey from 1 to 10. Now you're probably thinking about things, maybe if you're an enterprise focus, selling services, the work it takes to get a customer live and recouping cash there. You might be thinking about multi-product. You might be thinking about selling more usage or consumption of the existing product that you've got into your base. So a CRO who's going to be successful at 10 to 25, they've got that layer in place underneath them. They're starting to think about the world a couple quarters out into the future. They're within a reasonable degree of forecasting accuracy. They're starting to diversify revenue. I think those are some of the big themes I've seen. I'll pause there. I'd love to see in that earlier half of the journey what you've seen, in terms of patterns from some of your other guests.
Really similar, Robby. We've heard a lot of that affirmed by other guests who have been in those more senior leadership roles at those kind of early stage, turning into growth stage companies. And you're exactly right. And this was certainly my experience. I was the 6th employee at a company called Looker back in 2013 and had no idea what I was doing or what we were doing or anything like that. And so the early stages from literally we had friends and family as customers, getting to that kind of $10 million mark is exactly what you said. Figuring out product market fit, figuring out what a sales process should be, trying to document as much as we possibly could so that we could create a more precise means of running revenue when the stakes are a bit higher. And there's more of an expectation that there is precision in how you're doing forecasting, that there is governance in the way that your sales process is running. I think you're exactly spot on.
And looking ahead, when you start to get into 30 million, 25 million plus in revenue, and you're talking about years where you're doing double-digit revenue, by that is 10 million plus in revenue growth and expansion year on year or more, this is where scale really starts to matter. And you need to have the ability to add capacity into your revenue model. And typically you're going to add that capacity through the introduction of more sales reps, more quota on the street. Basically, that could be account managers selling into your existing book. More frequently, it's going to be more inside or outside sales plus some amount of SDR capacity that you're building in. And that's going to be all about your enablement, your ability to onboard folks, your ability to consistently scale demand gen so that there's enough leads to feed everybody in the same way. And that starts to be a lot more about managing numbers. You're managing, at that point, you're leading leaders and you're influencing a lot more cross-functionally as a leader. This has been something that I've had to learn the hard way on just how to do it or not do it. Is a lot of your job as a CRO at that stage becomes influencing the product roadmap and making sure that you're aligned with your leaders across the business on the longer term strategy. You're not going to be able to go in and pull levers to make the number in the quarter the way that you were back when you were going from 1 to 10 million by getting 1 or 2 extra deals over the line. You need to be thinking about it much more in terms of the processes, and you use the word governance, which I think is a great way to think about it. The governance that you're using to drive that rigor and accountability around the forecast so that you can trust that the business is running day to day and you can be building for the future with your partners and your first team, which really your first team is the executive team as a CRO at that level. And that's a lesson that I've had to internalize and learn when you're in the field with your team, winning deals in the trenches, losing deals in the trenches, all the things that you're doing together, you build a bond. And sometimes as you scale, there can be a tendency to lean too much on my first team is the sales team, or my first team is the customer success or marketing team. But what the business needs as you start to get more scale is for you as an executive to treat the executive peers on the team as your first team. And that's been a lesson I've had to learn. I'm curious for you as somebody who CMO now at Clary, what your experience has been going from first team marketing to first team executive, and if you have a perspective on that.
It's such a good point, Robby, because I was going to double click into this exact point because we've had similar roles in the past, but we've taken divergent paths here. We both built SDR teams. We both led inside sales to a certain extent. And now I was a VP of growth and marketing. You were VP of sales, and now you're CRO, I'm CMO. And you're exactly right. In those more functional roles, when I was leading SDR teams, leading inside sales, even leading demand generation, it was my chain of command that I was hyper focused on. And yes, there's cross-functional work you always have to do, but my team at those points was my team. And that was how I thought about it. I was really focused on making in every single individual SDR, every single SDR manager as effective as they possibly could be. My role now, fast forwarding a handful of years or maybe a decade, is my first team is the executive team. And you made a great point about influencing the product roadmap. That's a huge lever for you to pull. And that's not something that you can just entirely rely on your product team. No matter how good your product team is, you, the CRO, CMO, you've got a lot more firsthand experience. You're spending more time in the field. You're getting more feedback. You're on the front lines, or at least your team is on the front line. If you aren't expanding your scope of influence to be more cross-functional, you're not going to be an effective executive. And it's just as simple as that.
100%. Honestly, I've struggled with this a bit. I think that there's a tendency in sales leadership and in go-to-market leadership for leaders to often be very convicted in their perspective and try to inspire change through their own perspective. And what I've found is a much more effective way to influence change. For me, it was like, oh yeah, duh, influence change across the executive team. Let's just go do that today. But I didn't understand the how very well. And in my experience, the thing that I've learned really through mistakes has been that the influence piece is much more about bringing people along for the journey and making sure when you're trying to drive change in the organization that you understand the perspective of the different executives on the team and you get their fingerprints on the change or the work to be done and make sure that you're enlisting that buy-in and that feedback ahead of time. Because if you make assumptions and you're not curious about how this might impact their world or the goals that they're trying to reach, the consequences are far greater because the reach you have and the impact you have at that kind of scale affects everybody in the organization. And you just need to be conscious of that. That's been one of the things for me that I had to learn the hard way.
I'm right there with you, Robby. And I'll say there's a slow down to speed up advice that I would give people as well, where a lot of folks, they think, if I need to bring all these people along and I need to get everybody to stack hands and get everybody on board, then I'm never going to get anything done. And the fact of the matter is, you're never going to get anything done if you don't take this really critical first step. You may move faster at the outset, but you're never going to actually get anything across the line. So I see and hear a lot of executives that they get 80, 90% there, but they can't ever get a big initiative through, or they can never get the support they need or the headcount they need or whatever it is. And it almost always comes back to the fact that they never set a really solid cross-functional foundation. They never got the entire executive team, or at least the relevant folks on the executive team, bought in on their vision and what they were trying to do. And so they would end up getting blocked at the end. And that's so frustrating.
It's really well said. And I think a common thing that first-time executives experience, if you want to be the kind of person who scales from stage to stage and makes that leap, like you're going to run into these personal development opportunities is probably the right way to think about it. But at times feel hurdles or walls that you have to break through. Some of the advice maybe I'd give to emerging executives on the call is having a bench of people that you can talk to and open up to. I started in this role working with an executive coach 3 years ago. We've met every week for just about 3 years now. And it's really helped me look at these types of opportunities, this type of feedback as an opportunity to grow and become the executive at the next level. This is a really difficult type of thing to be able to just do by yourself. And my advice to folks on the call would be to surround yourself, whether it's with mentors, friends, peers in the industry that you can bounce these types of challenges off. That's how I've found working through it is possible.
We are launching a Clary Coach program for this exact reason. We're hearing a ton from our customer base that, gosh, it'd be great to speak with another person, VP of RevOps in some company my similar size, and just learn from them and find success the same way that she found success or whatever it might be. We have the same problems. And so we're trying to be more of these connectors between and amongst our community of prospects and customers. So anyway, we're on the same exact page. The other transition that I think, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, I'll be interested to hear your response. As you've made this transition from building an SDR team to running inside sales, a VP of sales, and now you're CRO, the obvious, I think, new scope change for you is the customer business. Expansion, cross-sell, upsell, retention, however you want to frame it. How are you thinking about that new purview? How has that changed the way you approach the role?
I came into AgentSync as a VP of sales. I was promoted to CRO, but the additional scope of the customer success team came a year into being a CRO, so it wasn't initially scoped in. I've had the customer success, revenue operations teams for about a year now. One of the first things I realized was that I'm not an expert in this, and I need to go find someone great who is. We hired really talented VP of customer success and a really talented head of revenue operations. And the way I've thought about it is primarily around clearing hurdles and giving them space to run because of their expertise. For me as a CRO, what that's afforded me the opportunity to do is think really about revenue diversification. All of us who were working in this space from 2020 to 2022, it was an explosion of zero interest rate phenomenons, a ton of venture capital fundraising, a ton of just purchases and transactions and sales reps making their number halfway through the year and all these things. And it felt a bit of a gold rush. And then we came back down to earth this year. I think it's really healthy and good for everyone to learn how to do this in hard times too. And I think one of the things that it's exposed is quality of revenue, quality of customers as something that companies need to be really mindful of. And what I mean by that is, are the customers in your base exposed to these macroeconomic conditions? So they have the kind of P&L and cash flow to withstand this type of headwind. And if they don't, you've got a problem. And that's really something that you need to be thoughtful about and address. As you think about the products you're building, the ideal customer profile you're selling to, are you selling to the type of company that has durability and that is going to stick with you and have lifetime value when you think about it in core SaaS metrics? I think for me, as I took over this team on customer success, one of the very first things we did was we gave the CSMs quotas specifically around retention. The CSMs themselves, I knew that I wasn't going to come in and totally transform the way our CSMs operated, but I did know about incentives. And I did understand I could go hire a really good leader and then I could make some tweaks to the incentives. And the incentive piece, By giving the CSMs a quota around retention and then also giving that same retention quota to the AEs that were ultimately responsible for getting the renewal done, we were able to align the incentives pretty well and had a really strong year in terms of revenue retention. And I think that also getting the organization to understand what quality customer revenue looks like has been interesting. And we've got now a roadmap looking ahead to next year of how we're going to drive more revenue from our existing base of customers by providing them more value. And that just wasn't really something that we were thinking a whole lot about the first couple of years. There's been a lot written and talked about in terms of should customer success report to CROs. It's pretty dependent on the type of company that you work for. In our case, our customers, they buy the solution that we sell, whether it's from us or another vendor, and they keep it in place typically for a decade before they make a change. You've got an opportunity to really get ingrained and have a great relationship, and making customer success a bit more of a revenue-oriented function was just an opportunity for us.
I want to drill into this a bit more, Robby, because it should be top of mind for every CRO, if it's not already, this concept of protecting your revenue, growing the customer base. And what's really interesting is, and again, paraphrasing here, so putting words back in your mouth, correct me if I get any of this wrong, is what the industry is talking a lot about, Robby, is this concept of revenue leak. You have this annual, what's supposed to be recurring revenue, especially obviously SaaS models, but a lot of that revenue is leaking. And it's not just in your new logo sales process, it's also, as you just alluded to, in the customer base. And churn is the most obvious example of revenue leak that happens in a post-sales universe. But it's not all revenue is created equal, not all churn is created equal. And the way that you're thinking about being smarter about what does high quality revenue look like? How does that help us diversify our revenue streams? How does that help us protect against revenue leak? It sounds like all of these things are connected. Give us a little more detail on how you've defined that high quality revenue and how you're hunting it.
It's a great question. I think we're still in the process. I think at the core of it was what you would call ideal customer profile. Think of that as your bullseye, the customer with not only the highest propensity to buy, but the highest propensity to be successful and then continue to use your product for a long time, to retain. I think been missing from the equation a little bit is probability to retain versus kind of flash in the pan probability to buy, but then might churn later. So ICP is at the core of that. And then I think you have to think about your cost to serve. For us, we sell to the top end of the enterprise, and a lot of these customers need a significant amount of implementation resources to get certain systems integrated to make it all work. Have to price in delivery and implementation fees in a more significant way than I've seen in my past life. You have to factor that in. The other part of it is post-sales. What is your cost to serve the customer? If you've got an enterprise customer that's got a really similar cost to serve as a mid-market customer, the sort of return you're getting on that enterprise customer who's paying you maybe twice as much is a lot higher than the mid-market customer that you're paying the same amount of delivery and implementation and the same amount of post-sale support to serve. As an organization, you need to have these concepts when you think about who are we all going after, who are we serving, who are we building for, marketing to, selling to, delivering for. And I think that's what we think about as ideal customer profile. And then that cost to serve piece is a really important piece of it. The other part, when you think about healthy revenue, the most popular metric I think that you would use to measure something like that would be lifetime value. And then you'd think about acquisition cost against lifetime value, like CAC to LTV kind of ratio. And ideally, there's been a lot written about this. The team at Kraft wrote a good article that they called difficulty ratio. It's a relatively simple concept, but it's basically number of days it took to sell the deal divided by the dollars that you took home. So in other words, faster deals for higher dollar amounts are going to be where you really want to focus. Goes without saying. But there's difficulty ratios that you can also think about post-sales. And I think that's, again, where people miss is, okay, we can be really intentional about difficulty ratio to acquire, but that has to translate to a customer that's going to stick with you for years and years on renewals and renewals. Because in SaaS, you pay a lot of money up front to acquire customers typically, and you don't actually get the return until you're a year and a half into the relationship. So you want customers that are going to stay a long time. And I think for me, it's been a good incentive alignment for me as the CRO who carries the full number to think about how can I orient my go-to-market team in a way that's going to acquire durable long-term customers and customers that are going to maybe hit the number this year, but put us at risk next year. And I like having that level of accountability to also owning the churn number because it makes me really be intentional about what customers are we trying to acquire in the first place.
And if your incentives are aligned toward that and against that churn number, Robby, I know you mentioned CS quotas based on retention, AEs have some sort of renewal quota, the commissions that are paid for new logo lands. Is there any risk to clawing those back if that new logo churns? Or how do you think about aligning all the incentives all the way down to the individual sellers?
This to me is one of the most fun parts of the job for me. I love incentive alignment. I think it's one of the most interesting kind of psychological parts of being in a leadership position, because ultimately incentives drive behaviors. And having done this for a long time, what I can say is that's a fact. It's true. That does happen time and time again. When I think about clawbacks and how do you weight the incentives, you really just have to think about like what output and outcomes do you want this individual team and person to drive. In the case of account executives for us today, I want them to spend 90% of their time thinking about new logos, selling new business, acquiring new customers, expanding our footprint in the industry, expanding the types of customers we're working with, and 10% of their time working on continued relationships with their existing book of customers and looking for upsell opportunities and working renewals as much as transacting and processing renewals. Whereas a CSM, I want them to spend 90% of their time focused on creating and delivering value, delivering on the promise of value for that book of customers, and 10% of their time looking for potential upsell opportunities within that base of account, as well as getting those renewals teed up for the AE. So in doing that, that's how we balance the incentives a little bit. For the AEs, 90% of their comp is tied to basically their retirement of quota, and then 10% is tied to what we call a gross revenue retention number. And we set a target there of kind of high 90s, and you got to make sure your book retains at that level. And so it does impact your comp and what you take home. I wouldn't even call that nominal. It's in a slightly more than nominal way. And this is the first year we've done it. We went from many startups, like one individual superhero handling all renewals for the entire company, to decentralizing it and having a team of people do it. And it was a bit of a risk in terms of moving that onto the team. And I've been really happy with how they responded. So I would just encourage CROs that are going through this evolution of stages and journey to consistently rethink incentives every year. We're coming up on fiscal planning season right now as we move into the new fiscal year for most companies. And it's always a good opportunity to look at, do we have the incentives we need aligned with like the organizational goals, and not to just like assume that because you did last year, you will going into next year.
100%. That's really well said. And we could spend a lot more time on the incentive structure and all those types of things. I'm curious to dive in more on the topic of protecting your revenue and churn being a major source of revenue leak, especially right now. Macro conditions are hard. And you mentioned a couple of different things, Robby. You mentioned the value journey that your CSMs are taking people on. You also mentioned this concept of value delivery. It's funny, we talk all about annual recurring revenue. The flip side of that is annual recurring value that needs to be delivered to earn that revenue. Just because you land that customer does not mean they're going to be a customer for life if you do not fulfill on the initial scope of what you outlined and then continued scope of increased value delivery. So how are you thinking about mitigating that revenue leak, mitigating that churn by having this always on system of value delivery and communicating that overall value journey to customers?
I'm really going to paraphrase our VP of customer success here, who's doing a really good job at this. But the program that we've set up, at the time, we didn't have a strong enough aligned understanding with our customer on their expectation of value post-sales and what we were delivering. There wasn't a strong framework and shared language for how we were doing and a mechanism to measure how we were doing against that. As a result of that, those conversations with customers were very case by case and subjective. In a nutshell is risk. If you really think about it, if you don't have a strong framework for predictability on value delivery, you've got risk in terms of your renewal cycles. So how do you change it? What do you do to like create that predictability? It starts with having a really strong post-sales process. We talk a lot about the pre-sales process. There's been a ton written about value selling, med pick, different methodologies that you can use. We don't talk as much about it post-sales and that value journey and the milestones that you want to be hitting with customers. So we try to think about this holistically. In the pre-sales process, what we're doing is taking the time to understand what are ultimately the positive business outcomes that we're trying to drive with this customer. How are we going to measure those positive business outcomes? The thing that we weren't doing a great job at early on was transferring that commitment and that plan from the pre-sales team to the post-sales team, and then continuing to use that language and do regular check-ins. What we do today is we've totally transformed it. We make sure that economic buyer who was really involved in the deal but isn't logging into our product every day and using it necessarily, that they're present. And we have some kind of regular executive check-in where I myself or one of our co-founders has a regularly scheduled quarterly call with every enterprise customer we have in our business. And we actually come prepared with here's some of the value we're driving in our organization, and have a conversation about what's going on in their business. And so executive sponsorship, having a really dialed in process, and then making sure that all the work you're investing in and doing pre-sales, the plan that you're building with the customer, the ROI you agree you're going to deliver, making sure that gets handed off so you're not having to rebuild it from scratch a year into the relationship. And things happen too. Champions leave and take new jobs. You're always working to maintain and ensure that we have a shared understanding that this is the actual way that we're measuring success. So it's an imperfect science, but I've grown to have a lot of respect for strong customer success leaders, and having to balance that need to serve and please customers with the need to hold the ground and make sure that we're marching against the plan that we've all built together. And that's a tricky balance. I'm excited about the next generation of customer success leaders. I think we're going to see CROs come out of VP of customer success roles in some organizations as well.
100%. It's net dollar retention, I think, is becoming the number one metric that public markets are rewarding as they look at IPOs in 2023, which I thought is really interesting. In this conversation around churn, Robby, is that churn is a lagging indicator. Like you can't just say, we're going to stop churn and you have a comprehensive plan. What you just outlined, and again, why the industry is thinking about more of death by 1,000 cuts or revenue leak is because executive presence, post-sales process rigor, handoffs, all of these are areas of potential leak that you can go and plug very intentionally and very strategically, and then you can, on the whole, prevent churn. So on this point on handoffs, because this is a huge thing, not just in this post-sales, pre to post-sales handoff, but same thing happens. SDR to AE handoff, AE to SE handoff. However your FLMs get involved, there's handoffs that get met. But let's talk about this post-sales one, pre to post-sales. What did you do to really operationalize that handoff internally? How did you make sure that handoff, that complete comprehensive handoff is happening from pre-sales to post-sales?
The first thing we did was make sure that the underlying sales process, we call it our customer engagement process. Our customer engagement process and the frameworks that we use are consistent into the post-sales process. That's simple things, the use of the word champion and understanding the champion the same way pre-sales as post-sales, the use of the word economic buyer, pre-sales and post-sales. So this kind of MEDPIC framework being used, not just pre-sales, but post-sales. And then some of the underlying concepts around understanding what those positive business outcomes that we're trying to drive are, and then transferring those post-sales. We also bring CSMs into deals. And so when we're getting late stages and opportunities, CSMs are getting to know our customers, and they're starting to talk about the plan for implementation and what that's going to look like. The presence of having that kind of owner of the relationship and that handoff is really critical. And that's something where we've really introduced our customer success team earlier before kind of contract signature, and that's been helpful as well. And then we think about our customer success managers playing a really critical role during the implementation period, where they themselves are not the DRI or the directly responsible individual of the implementation, but they are managing the relationship as we march through it. We've tried to really introduce this concept of time to value for CSMs, and thinking about the work we're doing as how do we get customers value in the shortest possible time frame from the time that they sign, and putting the customer success manager in charge of that. And what that time to value looks like can be a little bit different customer to customer, but that's been another good concept that I think has helped us think about transferring this responsibility post-sales. And then honestly, Kyle, there's a cultural piece of it. We talk about our customer success team as just as impactful to revenue as our sales team. And I think everybody understands that sales carries a bigger bag in terms of the overall number for the year. But when you look at our entire base of customers, that number's a lot bigger than what we're bringing in this year. And so you need to give everybody their flowers in terms of what it takes as a team to impact and consistently reiterate this message of the role we all play, not in acquiring customers alone, but in retaining revenue. Because that's the game, is retaining revenue and building on it and having that thing compound over time. And if you've got revenue leakage, you said earlier, it's really hard to get all of those wonderful benefits of being a SaaS.
This simple math bears it out. Let's just make the numbers easy. If you're a $100 million company and you're growing 30%, which a lot of us would love to be growing right now in this macro climate at that revenue, that means that you've got $30 million of new revenue, but $100 million that needs to be renewed. That's 3 times bigger. And so of course, CSMs, account managers, whatever you call them, give them their flowers, make sure they understand that they are as revenue critical as the new logo team. What I'm seeing, Robby, is a lot of CROs are similar to you. They're graduated VPs of sales, but they're dissimilar to you because they haven't leaned in on the post-sales process. They still love and adore the new logo team because it's how they grew up, and they don't fully understand the post-sales business. And so they just don't celebrate it nearly as much. And I think that's a really important shift that CROs need to make.
Agreed. I still like to swim where the water's the warmest. And for me, that is definitely in the new logo universe. But the biggest unlock that I've seen has been finding a great leader. An interesting moment right now, and you're seeing some of these communities of like customer success leadership that are popping up all over the place. And I think that we're going to see another generation of revenue leaders that are coming up through this customer success universe and how we think about greatness as it relates to retention and expansion, and not just new logo acquisition. That's going to be a really healthy balance for go-to-market and revenue leaders and the emerging chief customer officer role.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Robby, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. Where can people go to learn more about you, and where can people go to learn more about AgentSync?
If you happen to be in the insurance industry and looking to streamline compliance, you can take out AgentSync. I don't know how many people on this podcast will be, but in terms of me, I'm one of these folks where I'm pretty in deep in the job each day, and I probably could afford to post a bit more, but I'm trying to get better at that. You can find me on LinkedIn, just /in/Robby Allen, and I'm on Twitter, or X, I should say, a little bit too. So you can find me in both those places, and I'm happy to connect with folks here. And Kyle, it's been a pleasure. I love what you guys are doing. I love the discussion that you're driving around revenue holistically. It's a pleasure to even try to contribute in a little way.
And I can't let you go without asking my bonus question, which is, I'm curious to hear about one book that has been really impactful for you personally or for your career. And it could go down the straight and narrow path and give me a business book, sales book, or you could go book of poetry, novel. I don't care what it is. Curious to hear what book has been influential for you and why.
I've been taking a little bit of a break from kind of nonfiction business books recently, but I would say that the one that I probably pick back up the most often is The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh. I'm a big Bay Area sports fan, having grown up there. And it's not because it's a book about the 49ers, and it's not because it's a book about business. Really, for me, it's a book about excellence and a book about how just taking care of the little things every day, getting really dialed on what you can control and owning those things. Everybody can do that. And if you do that well, the score will take care of itself. And I think coming up in this world of kind of high growth, venture backed software companies, the expectations are huge. You go into the year, we're trying to triple revenue this year. And if you're staring at the scoreboard every quarter, that's not really a great way to get the work done that needs to get done. And so the kind of MO and the motto that I try to bring every day is just 1% better every day. And I think that as a compounding effect has done all right for me. And that book does a really good job breaking that down in plain English of how you make something great and excellent. When you do that, the score takes care of itself. So that'd be my recommendation.
Unsurprisingly thoughtful. Thank you so much. Robby Allen, CRO at AgentSync. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks again.
Likewise. Thanks, Kyle.
And that is a wrap for this episode of the Run Revenue Show. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share with your friends and family, and we will catch you next week for the next episode.
Don't let what you heard today go to waste. Take 2 minutes to download today's checklist to get your priorities in line for the week. You can find that linked in our show notes. And if you liked what you heard, make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. We'll be back next Monday with more to help you win your week.